Thank you very much. As you might have guessed from that introduction, I'm very interested in medieval castles. And so, of course, that's what I'll be talking about. But first of all, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I'm very excited to be here, not least because this is the first time I've given a talk to a room full of people since November 2019. So it's been a long time, and it's lovely to be back. So, I'm going to talk about one of my favourite topics, medieval castles, but a particular thing that happened to them, a particular process, looking at basically what happened to them when they were destroyed. I think for me it goes back to what fascinates me about these places in the first place. They are fantastic ruins to explore. And at some point it occurred to me to ask, how did they get to this state? And that's what really led to this particular research project. There have been a lot of work looking at why castles had been founded and how they developed, architectural trends and so on. But later on in that life cycle, there'd been less interest in what happened to them afterwards, what happened when they fell out of use, and why they ended up being abandoned or in ruins. So, oh, sorry about that. Right, so this is a summary of what I'll be talking about. I'll be explaining a bit about what slighting is, because it's a bit of a specialist term. You might have heard of it in passing, but there's a good chance it won't have been well defined. And then I'll be talking about how our understanding of slighting has changed over time. And most importantly, what's the evidence that's gone into this? I'll then mention how this was actually done. What were the process involved with slighting? And then I'll be talking about a really fantastic place, Pevensey Castle, and applying the various methods and approaches to understand slighting to understand what happened at Pevensey in 1216. So let's start at the beginning. What does destruction have to tell us about the past? So a whole range of different types of destruction. Man-made, natural, accidental and deliberate, total and tokenistic. And within that spectrum, there are a whole lot of different reasons and motivations involved in those acts. And how people respond to destruction tells a lot about the values of society at the time. And so looking at medieval castles in particular, it helps us understand a bit about the power dynamics of society at that time. So for a lot of it, we're going to be looking at the people in society who had power. Earls, magnates, barons and kings, the people with authority. And how these buildings were treated, the way they were damaged, tells us about how they were understood to have significance to people and to society at large. And as a medievalist, I would hesitate to go too far beyond my own area of expertise, but I think that what can be learned about destruction in the Middle Ages speaks to other time periods as well. The post-medieval especially, perhaps Roman and prehistoric as well. And there'll be other situations where this kind of approach can be useful. So, I mentioned slighting a couple of times. It's a particular form of destruction. And we have a brief definition here explaining that it is the deliberate damage of a high status structure and with the intention of degrading its value. So that value can take a number of different forms. But essentially, this is meant to reflect the multifaceted use of high status buildings. It's not just about fortifications and castles, although that's where you will find the term slighting most often used. Despite that, I think it's a notion that's applicable to other circumstances. So this is a picture of Rievaulx Abbey. which was ruined during the dissolution of the monasteries. And so this particular kind of destruction is almost never described as slighting. In fact, I can't find a single instance of that. But for all intents and purposes, the way I understand it at least, it could reasonably be described as that, because it's not tied to a particular military use. It's about high status buildings and how society reacted to them. Now, what was the motivation behind this destruction? Why did it actually take place at all? Degrading the value of a structure, as I said, covers a few different kinds of value. So, I'm going to start with the reason that is the long-standing answer to why places were slighted. For decades, if you've come across a castle that's been slighted, the reason put forward is usually to prevent an enemy from using it against a person who carried out this act. And that really goes to the heart of a whole discussion around the purpose of castles. Were they first and foremost military structures, or did they involve elements of high status living? And were they used as status symbols as well? And castle studies has undergone a historiographical change over the last few decades, which has tried to introduce more of these factors and nuance our understanding of castles. So the military use is absolutely there, but it's not always the only reason. And in fact, when it comes to slighting, preventing your enemy from using it against you in warfare, I would say it was only a minority of cases that was a primary justification, because there are a whole different range of other factors. So, destroying a high status residence meant that people couldn't live there anymore. It would disrupt centers of administration, and very interestingly, it could be used to punish the owner. So, slighting seems to be quite common in the 12th and 13th centuries in particular. And towards the end of the Middle Ages, it really seems to tail off. And broadly speaking, this correlates with execution, capital punishment, becoming more common. I wouldn't say it's necessarily an either damage property or execute someone you've fallen out with situation, but there is some kind of correlation there. And in damaging someone's property, if that property is used as an expression of status and of the self, then you are attacking that expression and damaging that person's authority and status. So all of these factors come into play with the destruction of castles. And so I'm just going to cover this very briefly. But essentially, there's been a lot of development in how the understanding of slighting has progressed over the last, well, nearly 2 decades now. So essentially, it started with this generalization that it was always to prevent your enemy from using a castle against you. In the 80s and 90s, Michael Thompson was the first person to actually start to draw together some evidence about slighting. He compiled a list of slighted castles in relation to the English Civil War. He didn't use this to challenge the preconceived ideas about what slighting was and why it was carried out, but importantly, bringing this stuff together made it possible to do some analysis, and so people were able to work with his information. And gradually, at the start of the 21st century, there was an appreciation that castles had an important role symbolically. And so one of the first mentions of this I can find comes in the work of Matthew Johnson, who mentions it quite briefly, but makes a very good point that slighting could be done for symbolic purposes. It wasn't always just for one reason. And then really came a very important leap in our understanding about destruction. Lila Rakowski did her PhD thesis on this particular topic and the English Civil War. She was working with a fantastic body of information, standing buildings, archaeological record, and the historical record as well. I must admit, I'm quite jealous because the sources, especially the standing buildings and the historical documents, are much richer compared to the medieval sources I've been working with. A few extra years of loss and decay has definitely come into effect there. And then other people were taking part in this. So Rachel Askew introduced the idea of political iconoclasm in understanding slighting. And then I decided that the English Civil War had been treated very well with this particular area of research, but the Middle Ages was really crying out for some research into this. And this is a bit about what I'll be talking about in more detail. And moving on from this, other people still are getting involved. Audrey Thorstad is looking at the role of gender in destruction, and Giuliana Bellato is looking at destruction of urban residences in Italy. And this isn't about castles, but it's an analogous situation, high status places in the Middle Ages and how they were treated. And now I'm going to talk about the evidence, what it is we're working with, what are the pieces that we're trying to put back together and build a picture of what happened. Essentially, it's a fairly standard array of stuff. Documentary sources, they're always very handy. They give us some useful context. Standing buildings, where possible. This is a picture of Kenilworth Castle, which was slighted during the English Civil War in the 17th century. In the Middle Ages, if a castle was slighted, there's a much greater chance that the ruins aren't going to be nearly as impressive. If you think of a castle that's been slighted, you're most likely thinking of one which was slighted during the Civil War. There's Kenilworth and Corfe in particular, are the really photogenic ones. And then there's evidence from excavation, actually getting stuck in on the ground and seeing what's there. And that has a lot to offer in terms of working out dating evidence, working out patterns of destruction on an individual site, and tell us a lot about life at castles. And there's also geophysical survey, which takes a different approach, looks at larger scale areas as opposed to excavation, and that's because of cost and resources available. But the tricky bit is, it's not always straightforward to interpret those results as slighting. And then there's a bit about the methods involved in destroying castles. So basically, with 4 of these, they were used throughout the Middle Ages and into the 17th century. And gunpowder, the use of gunpowder, is a bit of a red herring. I should probably start with that. So if you were to visit a site which was slighted during the English Civil War, you're probably going to hear 2 things. First of all, that it was probably all Oliver Cromwell's fault, and secondly, that the castle was blown up. It's not quite that simple. So in a great many cases, Oliver Cromwell wouldn't have been involved at all. Parliament did give a fair few orders to destroy castles, but so did the Royalists as well. And when it comes to gunpowder, very often this wasn't actually used. It's a bit of almost wishful thinking. Because if you're looking at these ruins and you see the state they're in, it is tempting to say, well, we know they had cannons, they must have blown them apart, very literally. And there are instances where that did happen, but it seems that by and large, it was much more likely that other methods of destruction were being used. So when you see that at sites, always question what that's being said there, and try and think about what underpins that particular line of thinking. So the other methods. We've got mining, which involved digging underneath a stone wall or digging to the base of it. And the purpose of that was to collapse the wall. You wouldn't necessarily try to bring the entire structure wall down. If you could poke a hole in it, essentially, that would be a very effective way of reducing its military value, but also addressing its symbolism. The strength of a castle, even metaphorically speaking, comes from its completeness. So if you are showing that it's been damaged, then you are very strongly attacking that particular purpose, as well as, of course, you are creating a headache when it comes to defending the castle. Burning was it was a relatively simple thing to do, as opposed to mining, which requires some fairly specialist skills. Even stone castles would have wooden elements. We're talking about roof timbers, flooring, even doors. And so you could, theoretically, set fire to a stone castle. And of course, it was something you could do to a timber castle. This wasn't necessarily an easy thing to do. You would have to deliberately cultivate the fire. But it is a good indication of deliberate slighting. And there was also digging. Now, this is a fairly arbitrary term. I should point out here that these terms were not used in the Middle Ages to describe how they were destroying castles. They were more likely to use terms such as utterly throw to the ground. But digging, that's used to refer to basically leveling banks, your moats as well, any kind of earthwork, and filling in ditches. So that's a really time-consuming activity, and one which has some kind of fairly limited payoff. With something like the other activities, it's very obvious when slighting is taking place. If you're trying to just level a bank and fill in a ditch, that's not something which is going to be visible from very far off, but does have military value. And then there's picking. What this refers to is deliberately dismantling a structure. Essentially, going in with a pickaxe and various other tools and taking it apart from the top down. What this does is it maximizes possible reuse of building materials in there. So you get to reuse seasoned timbers, facing stone, and any other materials such as lead or window glass as well. I should probably also point out that while people were very keen to remove facing stone, as it was a valuable resource which could be reused, they were much less interested in the rubble stone that made up the actual interior of the walls. And so you're likely to find a lot of that still intact at sites. And all of these particular methods leave their own kind of fingerprint at sites. So I've talked a bit about the various methods and the various source materials we have to understand slighting, but I want to look at it in relation to one particular site, rather than just abstract. So what I'm going to do is go through each of those particular types of evidence, give an outline of what it is they tell us, what the limitations are, and then look at how they relate to Pevensey. And Pevensey is a fantastic site. It's on the screen behind me there. If you haven't been, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a medieval castle built within, well, not quite the corner because that's an oval, but within one part of a 3rd century Roman fort. And the Roman site itself is quite unusual since it's got this oval shape. And it had a very lively history. It was besieged 4 times. It was owned by royal favourites and at various points in time the crown itself. And later on in its history, after it had fallen into ruin, it was adapted for use during World War II. So there are in fact pillboxes camouflaged around the site. There is so much activity going on at Pevensey. And that is an important point because it does complicate the picture. There are other sites where unpicking the evidence is much simpler because there's been much more restricted activity. But it's part of the challenge that makes it interesting at Pevensey. So, the written materials. what kind of stuff are we working with here? So for the Middle Ages, and that's where most of my focus will be, we're dealing with royal records such as the pipe rolls and the close rolls and chronicles. So those particular rolls often record expenditure on particular activities. So we might find mention of, for example, spending on buying 100 picks to dismantle a castle at Bennington. So that gives us an idea of the size of the workforce involved in dismantling a stone castle in the Middle Ages. And you get little snippets like that here and there. That kind of detail is actually fairly uncommon. What you're more likely to get is record of spending which go to some local figure, such as a sheriff, along with instruction to dismantle a particular castle, to throw it to the ground. And that's often all we get. With chronicles, they tend to be a bit different. So we might find that they will generalize or have more sweeping statements. So they tend to come up with stuff like, there's one particular chronicle which says that Robert the Bruce, in the 14th century, destroyed every single castle in Scotland except for one. And that is really very straightforward to disprove. So the point being, not to take that literally, but to take it figuratively. It shows how Robert the Bruce went about his war, went about defending Scotland against the English rule, and shows just to what lengths he went to, because destroying what was notionally castles which should have been under Scottish rule was quite an extreme thing to do. Unless you had to, you probably wouldn't demolish your own castles. And this is a theme we'll definitely be coming back to. And along with exaggeration, we lose some precision as well with the chronicles. We might not know which particular sites were involved. So, the Bishop of Winchester's castles in the 12th century, according to one particular chronicler, all of them were demolished, but we don't know the names of them. And so it gets a bit muddy. And there's also the issue that even if we do have a firm piece of documentary writing about a particular event, it's not always clear if the order was followed through on. So there's an instance in which Henry II gave instructions to demolish a castle, and then a few years later, there's a further royal record in which the owner is fined because his castle's still standing. So the order wasn't actually followed through on. Which is an important point. Slighting is actually an entire process. It's not just the destruction of a high-status building. It starts with that articulated intention to cause damage to a building. And there's a fair amount that the records don't tell us. They often don't tell us who was involved, how many people, what the local dynamics were. They don't tell us what happened to the materials afterwards. Were people trying to cart stuff off for their own reuse and profit? I should say that's the case for the Middle Ages. For the English Civil War, the sources are much richer. We can see some of those patterns coming through. So we know that with Pontefract Castle, for example, in Yorkshire, the local townspeople were closely involved in the destruction of the castle. They were getting involved, and people were bidding for the raw materials. They were bidding for the stone, the glass, the lead. And so, though we don't have those sources from the Middle Ages, it doesn't feel like much of a stretch to think that kind of activity might have been happening as well. So how does this relate to Pevensey? So it has a fantastic chronology, but what I'm really interested in is an event that took place in 1216. At this point, King John was at war with the barons. He had reneged on Magna Carta, appealing to papal authority, and the barons took up arms against him. The barons at this point in the war were actually not doing particularly well. So they appealed to Prince Louis of France, heir to the throne of France. And they said to him, essentially, you can be King of England if you help us defeat John. And so Louis landed in southern England in 1216. On his retreat in the face of these landing forces, John travelled through Sussex and Hampshire and gave orders along the way to destroy the castles at Pevensey and Hastings. And we're relying on a contemporary chronicler for that. So it's one step removed from the royal records. But I would say there's no reason to disbelieve this particular chronicle. I think it's entirely plausible that John wanted these castles destroyed. And there's a good reason for that. It was an unusual thing to destroy your own fortifications, but for John, it wasn't unprecedented. When he was facing losing Normandy to the French, he actually started to demolish some of the fortifications there as well. So it's a tactic he previously used outside England. And it wasn't just Pevensey and Hastings that he gave orders to destroy. We have royal records, which tell us that in May that year, he gave orders to destroy the castle of Middleton Stony in Oxfordshire. And the following month, he also gave orders to destroy Knepp Castle, also in Sussex. And he was specific about how it should be done. He said it should be burned. And that's really interesting because the method often doesn't come through in the documentary sources, at least not explicitly. And it's also interesting because Knepp Castle, it might have had wooden elements. For example, it's entirely possible that there was a timber palisade which surrounded it. But we know that at the very least, there was a stone great tower in the middle of the castle. So burning would have been used against a stone building had his orders been followed. And later on, royal records from Henry III show that his predecessor, King John, gave orders to demolish Chichester Castle, but they were ignored. In fact, they were ignored so thoroughly that the people in charge of Chichester Castle surrendered to Prince Louis instead. So John's authority was on pretty shaky ground. So based on the documentary evidence, there's good reason to think that Pevensey might have been slighted, but we know from looking at other places, those orders might not have been followed. So what else do we have on our plates? Well, there are standing buildings. This is a picture of Kenilworth Castle. So this is making the general point. Standing buildings can preserve particular types of evidence. So there might be scorch marks, which show where burning took place, or evidence of rebuilding and repairs, which kind of crystallize that particular destructive event. And the distribution of the damage is also really interesting. So at Kenilworth, this is the keep, the Great Tower. It was a focal point of the social activity, and it was one of the most prominent parts of the castle. It was also a really secure structure. During the war with the barons, the keep of Rochester Castle ended up being a holdout during a siege conducted by King John. So they had a great deal of strength just by virtue of their size. And what's really interesting about this structure is that just one wall has been pulled down here. And this took place in the English Civil War, so a different context, but it's worth keeping that in mind. What it tells us is that slighting didn't have to be complete. We're not talking necessarily about utter destruction of a site, although there are examples of this. Destruction could be focused on a particular area, or it could be even tokenistic. Slighting could relate just to removing crenellations from a building. And at Kenilworth, it meant at least part of slighting, was removing this wall. And what's really interesting is that Matthew Johnson, who I referred to earlier, pointed out that this was a wall which faced the town of Kenilworth. It was the most visible if you were on the outside of the castle. So it's making a very clear statement. This was destruction that was meant to be seen. It was meant to be viewed by the community, both people who lived in Kenilworth and people who were travelling through the area. Destruction had to be visible in this instance. And that's where something like complete and utter destruction of a site is sometimes, it gives an insight into different intentions. So in that case, the purpose might not be to preserve the memory of the destruction, but to convey an immediate message directly to the owner. And if you're looking at partial destruction, that's maybe something which is meant to be longer lasting in some senses. And so decades later, perhaps the message was that the owner fell from grace. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that destruction wasn't actually the end of these buildings' life cycles. From my research, I found that about half of the time these buildings were repaired or reused in some way. So while this looks quite permanent, if something like that happened in the Middle Ages, there's a good chance that the site might have been reused in any case, and it would have been just an episode in the castle's life cycle rather than a destructive end. But there are limitations to looking at this particular type of evidence. It can be difficult to say at which point a particular destructive event happened. And it's not always easy to look at a repair and say what necessitated it. It could have been collapse brought about by substandard workmanship or natural subsidence underneath the building. Or it could have been the owner wanted to remodel their particular property. So it can be quite tricky. And of course, we are much more likely to have standing stone buildings from the English Civil War than we are if they were slighted in the Middle Ages. Once you start damaging a building, you're opening up all kinds of processes which accelerate and degrade the building. And how does this apply to Pevensey? This is a painting of the castle in the late 18th century showing that the gatehouse to the Inner Bailey survived to its full height. You can see that it's not in perfect condition by any means, but if you were to visit today, you'd see how those extra 2 and a bit centuries have contributed to further decay of the site. And even allowing some artistic license, to be honest, I don't think it's in too bad condition. I don't look at that and think that was completely destroyed on the orders of King John. There was enough there still standing. And if you go to the site today, you can see that the Roman walls, which encircle the site, they're in fairly decent condition. In certain parts, they're standing to pretty much their full height. I think it's about 8 meters high. The only parts of the castle which are medieval are the Inner Bailey. And it's a complicated picture because the Inner Bailey was essentially rebuilt in the 1250s, so post-dating 1216 and our events relating to King John. But there are 2 important elements which predate 1216, the gatehouse and the keep. The keep itself is an absolute enigma. It survives to a little over basement level, but it's very difficult to work out what's going on there. And we don't have evidence that it was slighted. So we don't have, for example, scorch marks. The gatehouse survives in better condition, so we can be a bit more confident in saying that there's no evidence that the gatehouse was burned, for example. And if we assume that it was intact in 1216, we don't see evidence of stones being wrenched away from the curtain wall. For that, we're largely relying on this particular painting because the walls have since decayed a bit further. And there may have been some artistic license, but I feel reasonably confident that John Hamilton Mortimer did a fairly decent job because he's got the key features in the right place here, down to locations of the arrow slits. So he's done okay. And therefore it looks like the bits which survive weren't being dismantled on John's orders. So there are parts of the castle which we're missing. There's a lot of the Inner Bailey which we don't have access to because it's been rebuilt. And so we can't say for certain. Perhaps those were the elements which were slighted on John's orders. But we're just not sure. Geophysical surveys are a really handy tool. You can cover a large area quite quickly. In terms of slighting, what they can tell us is they can help show areas of burning and rubble spreads. So basically, heaps of building material just left lying about the place. And those can be identified through this survey. And that's what you might expect if a stone building has been demolished. The core of those walls probably left behind in majority of cases, while the facing stones would have been removed. But there's an issue with this. We wouldn't have dating evidence. We wouldn't be able to tell at what point a particular burning episode took place. We wouldn't be able to say, this heap of rubble, that must relate to 1216. So it can be an indicator that destruction took place, but very often it needs to be followed up by excavation to actually test that hypothesis. But it's a very helpful tool and can be used to sometimes corroborate or challenge documentary sources. And how does geophysical survey relate to Pevensey? So, in 2018, Scott Chauncey carried out a couple of geophysical surveys of the Outer Bailey. The Inner Bailey was left alone largely because it's been messed around a lot. And so actually getting a good area of coverage would have been quite tricky. But he has covered a large area of the Outer Bailey. So this actually is the Roman fort, which would have been reused in the medieval period as the Outer Bailey of the castle. So there would have been various activities going on here. There would have been horses stabled here, people coming and going, and perhaps various domestic activities. The geophysical surveys are really useful for showing up building layouts and perhaps even areas of burning. What we've found at Pevensey is that there aren't indications of those rubble spreads, which isn't necessarily surprising. It's entirely possible that buildings in the Outer Bailey would have been primarily timber. This is conjecture, but it's not an unreasonable one. So the absence of rubble doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't slighting going on. But there's also not any evidence of burning. So that could indicate that the castle wasn't burned, which is interesting because if you're retreating from an advancing force, you might be pushed for time. And so you go for the most rapid method. And that's kind of what burning a fortification was. It was quick and it was dirty. It wasn't particularly effective against stone structures, but it was better than nothing. And it wouldn't necessarily be easy as such, but it was a damn sight easier than trying to dig underneath the walls or dismantle a stone structure. So that is what most likely would have been used at Pevensey. So in this case, the absence of evidence is interesting. It's still, though, it's fairly circumstantial. And what does excavation have to tell us? An awful lot. It's very handy. So it can identify those destruction deposits. This is a section of a ditch at Deganwy Castle in Wales, which has been almost entirely filled with rubble from the wall. And we've helpfully got some documentary sources telling us that the castle was slighted. So we've got the motive behind that as well. We can confidently say that this wasn't an accidental collapse, this was deliberate. And it also helps because at various points on the site, this rubble layer was coming through, which means that if it's spread over a large area, it's much more likely to be deliberate. Excavation can also provide us with dating evidence, which is very helpful for actually tying it to particular events and perhaps even particular people. And it can provide evidence of small finds as well. So excavations at Dryslewin Castle in Wales were able to show that hinges were torn out of doorways when the castle was slighted. And that's a really fascinating piece of evidence. They were looking at, perhaps it was trying to reuse the materials, but also change how the site was accessed and change the security arrangements. But excavation definitely does have its limitations. So the dating evidence, if you find some, isn't always going to be precise. Very often we're going to rely on pottery evidence, which you might be able to tie to a broad range, perhaps say, for example, late 12th century or early 13th century, but that's a really wide range. For example, castles demolished in the 12th century, you'll often find that the narrative around that is that they were demolished as a result of the anarchy, the war between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda for control of England. And that's because we've got sources telling us that it happened. But that generalization means that we overlook other conflicts in that period and other contexts which slighting could have taken place in. For example, Henry II's sons rebelled against him in the 1170s, and we can confidently say that castles were slighted as a result of that. So that dating evidence does need to be handled with care. We need to be not overeager to pin it to one particular person or date. And there's also the possibility that unless the excavation is large scale, I don't necessarily mean the entire site or even a majority of it, but you can miss evidence. If we're looking at a site where part of the ditch was infilled or only part of the structure was burned or demolished, it's entirely possible that you might miss that because you weren't excavating in that area. Excavation is a costly and time-consuming process, and so it's entirely feasible you might just miss out by sheer bad luck. So again, if you don't find evidence of destruction at a site, doesn't mean it wasn't slighted. How does this relate to Pevensey? There have been a fair few excavations at Pevensey. So the area around the Roman West Gate, that's been excavated. This segment over here, there's been a very long line of trenches in that area. Area of the Roman East Gate has been excavated as well, and the medieval keep. Those areas have been subjected to excavation over the 20th, 21st, I think some bits in the 19th century as well. And they've uncovered lots of different types of evidence, but for our purposes, they've not found evidence of destruction relating to 1216, which leaves us in kind of a quandary. The evidence is therefore very circumstantial, but it's also worth pointing out that to the north here, we've got an area of collapse of the Roman wall, and along the south, an even greater stretch where the wall is absent. This is where cross-referencing with the documentary sources is really handy. So, from those, we know that the north wall collapsed actually related to the Second Barons' War in the 1260s. We've got a contemporary record recording damage and that the wall fell during this conflict. And along the south wall, it appears that this is actually the result of early medieval erosion, and that the walls collapsed a long time before 1216. So both of those gaps in the wall look to be red herrings. So let's see if we can tie it all together. We've got the documentary evidence, we've got standing buildings at Pevensey. This is a video showing the inner ward, most of which dates to the 1250s. At the top, you've got the stump of the keep, and at the bottom of the moment, you've got the gatehouse. And it's surrounded by those Roman walls in the background. We've got some geophysical evidence, which has come up empty-handed for signs of destruction. And we've got various bits of excavation around the site. If I was putting in trenches to look for evidence of slighting at Pevensey, I'd be probably putting them in the ditches around the castle, or ideally in the inner ward itself, as that's where the focus of medieval life was at Pevensey. The problem with that is that when the site came into state care in the early 20th century, the level of the inner ward had, by that point, built up by several feet, and it was cleared out to the medieval levels. And as far as we can tell, it wasn't actually recorded, so we don't know how much was swept out. It's entirely possible that the events of 1216 and evidence of destruction lie even further, even deeper beneath the current ground level. And that what we're seeing here might be the level of 1250. However, given the amount of messing about, it probably doesn't bode so well. On balance, it looks like Pevensey was never slighted, which tells us actually a fair amount about King John's authority in 1216. He gave instructions to demolish Pevensey, which must have been a significant blow to his personal authority. It was an admission that he was not able to hold the site and that he was losing the war. And so it was essentially, if it had been destroyed, or even a token gesture, it would have been a public admission of his own eroding authority. And this is emphasized if the orders were never acted on, as we saw at Chichester. Now, slighting your own buildings was very unusual, as I've mentioned. And it's worth saying that in most other circumstances, there were other motivations. The most common one was to punish the owner of the castle, especially if they'd rebelled against royal authority. It was a very good way of putting them in their place. And it also meant that it left the door open for them to go back to royal grace and favour. Buildings can be repaired and rebuilt. If you execute someone, it's much harder to reconcile with the king. So, to round it out, what can be done next? So, for my own particular research, I'm interested in applying this kind of approach to other sites, especially sites where we've got some documentary hint about what happened. So, I'm currently looking at Barnstaple Castle, where we've got a record which says that in 1228, King Henry gave instructions to reduce the height of the walls to 10 feet. That is a tough one to demonstrate archaeologically, but I'm going to do my best and see what it tells us about this site. And then there's Knepp Castle, which I mentioned earlier. So a place where we've got that very specific instruction to burn the site. And so this is all that stands at Knepp. There's not an awful lot to see, but I rather enjoyed visiting there for a couple of days on the hottest days of the year. And because we had this hypothesis that it was burnt, we can test that through geophysical survey. So magnetometry would hopefully be able to pick up whether the site was burned, whether burning took place in this area. It's going to be tricky, but that would be really interesting. And if that evidence isn't there, that's another one we can tick off and say that the orders were never carried out. But because slighting is a process from that intention to actually being carried out, it tells us a lot about royal authority at the time. And I mentioned that I would hesitate to go beyond my own period of interest, but I do think this is something which can be extrapolated beyond the Middle Ages, particularly with the Reformation and the dissolution of monasteries. And I feel this is also something which can be applied to other regional contexts as well. So almost certainly there's going to be a wealth of evidence from, off the top of my head, France. I think that'd be really interesting to look at. Sadly, my skills in French are lacking, so I don't think I'd be the person to do that. And I'd like to round out by saying that there are places you can go to get more information about slighting. It would be remiss of me if I didn't mention the magnificent work of Lyda Rakowski and her PhD thesis. It's freely available online. And if you're interested in medieval castles in particular, I publish a summary of my own PhD research in the Archaeological Journey. So all that remains for me is to say thank you very much for coming, everyone. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope to be carrying on in this research and taking on new approaches and new sites over the coming years. Thank you.